Welcome. It's good to see you all. I invite you to take a quick breath and center yourself. Obviously, an eventful day and an eventful few weeks in the life of our country. So holding all of that, the complexity of it, and what is to come next for a more just and equitable country, grounding ourselves in hope this day. So I'll turn it over to Molly for a chalice lighting.
Okay. I'm going to read a reading by Jennifer Grayson called Connected Through the Web of Life. We light this chalice, symbol of our purpose, to bring more love and justice into the world. We light this chalice knowing our congregation as a church dispersed across communities, not bounded by walls, but connected through the web of life.
Thanks, Molly. So I want to start off by doing a little bit of UU social justice history and grounding, and how where we find our spiritual tap roots for some of the work that we do in this congregation and in the wider movement. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to share with y'all. Just a moment here. There we go. So Unitarian Universalism, one of the taglines that our National Association has used on and off and in the last few years is nurture your spirit and help heal our world, encapsulating our theological and justice history in a short phrase, as to what our congregations are called to do and what us as individuals are called to do. So this opening reading is from Rosemary Bray McNatt, who's an African-American UU minister. She also is president of Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley and writes this about our congregations and what we're called to. She writes, "By no means are we, Unitarian Universalists, perfect. We often fail as much as we succeed. We do the work best when we remember what church is and what it is not. Church is not a place to hide. It's not the place to get away from the world. It is not a place where we get to pretend that the lives we live in our particular situations are not terribly complex, often confusing, and sometimes depressing. Church is the place where we stand with one another, look the world in the eye, attempt to see clearly, and gather strength to face what we see with courage, and yes, with joy." One of the hallmarks of universalism is a very positive view of humanity and our possibility to create a better, more equitable world, and our positive view theologically of human nature and the capacity to do good. And I love that phrase at the end, that we do this with joy, that often justice work can be quite sobering, fittingly so, and sometimes distressing. But there's also joy in that work, in the connections and relationships we make, and the progress that we see often on more local levels in those deep relationships built over time. So some spiritual grounding. These are very basic, almost orthodox definitions of Unitarian Universalism to get a little sense of history of where we're coming from. So Unitarianism, if you boil it down to its more historic understanding, the belief that wisdom comes from many sources and that the compelling nature of Jesus' teachings was not his unique divinity, but his ethical integrity and the possibility for all people to act similarly. So a moral teacher, and for most of Unitarian history, the primary teacher of ethics and morals. And part of the work then as a Unitarian was to act more like Jesus in terms of serving and loving your neighbor, welcoming the outcast and stranger. And universalism, of course, another tradition, the belief that all people are beloved of God, rejecting notions of human depravity. All deserve a life and world of equity, compassion, and unconditional love, which means justice. So you may have heard from injustice work in the wider Unitarian Universalist Association more recently that a modern understanding of the old theological belief of universal salvation, now we'd often call that collective liberation. The idea that we are to create heaven on earth with justice and equity and inclusion. And that is a modern interpretation of salvation, or the which comes from the root salve, or to heal. It's about wholeness and mending. And many biblical scholars back in universalism as well argue that that's what the whole point of universalism and really of Christianity and Jesus' teaching was about creating a just and equitable community. He'd probably be labeled the radical socialist these days. And as Molly read for our chalice lighting, just two brief stories about the actual symbol that we use each Sunday as being rooted in our justice work as well. So first, going back to the late 1300s in Czechoslovakia, to a priest named Jan Hus. Now, we don't have specific spiritual or theological lineage to Jan Hus, but he was one of the forerunners of the Reformation in terms of his teachings. So one of the things he did was have services in the vernacular, have it in the language of the people rather than only in Latin, and that was quite scandalous in the day. And the other thing he did was believe that all people coming to services and to Holy Communion should be offered both the bread and the wine, not only the priests receiving those. And he was tried for heresy and killed for those teachings. And there's an old story that just before he was executed, he offered Holy Communion to those he could near him before he was stopped by authorities from doing that. So we trace some of the imagery of the chalice as being this inclusive symbol for welcoming all to the table. And then Martha and Wait Still Sharp, which there was a beautiful documentary called Defying the Nazis not too long ago. You can still look it up, probably online pretty easily. We have some copies at the church too. They were Unitarians, and Wait Still was a Unitarian minister, and they were deep into work with the Unitarian Service Committee in World War II, helping Jews flee from Nazi territories. And they did it under secret, of course, but they needed official looking trucks and official looking papers. And to do that, they believed they needed some sort of branding. So they had Hans Deutsch, who is a Czechoslovakian artist, create the flaming chalice symbol so that they could put it on as their marketing ploy, that they were a legitimate humanitarian organization. And then they use that to help Jews flee from Nazi territory. So there's a beautiful documentary about their work. And again, the chalice there was used to legitimize their humanitarian service and was used as subversive, clearly a subversive work to empire. Going back just a few more slides, we won't go too much into history. There's a lot to cover there if we wanted to, but I wanted to lift up just a couple things. So one is the Edict of Torda back in 1568 in Hungary. Our one and only Unitarian king, as far as we know, King John Sigismund was king then, and he had a spiritual advisor named Francis David. And in that area in the 1500s, most villages were only one religion, and only one religion was allowed. There was one local church. And he, which is kind of funny, he converted from Catholicism to Lutheranism, and then Lutheranism to Calvinism, and then Calvinism to Unitarianism during his life. And so his edict was all four of those, all four which he had been, were welcome to be part of that region. And that local congregations could choose their preachers, that the state didn't need to mandate which religion was official, and thus everyone else outlawed. So the Edict of Torda, or the Edict of Religious Toleration, was one of the earliest, though not super pluralistic, but one of the earliest official edicts of welcoming more than just one religious tradition in an area. So this practice of pluralism. And then skipping ahead to the mid-1800s in the United States, to Unitarian Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, poet, abolitionist, suffragist, born in Maryland as a free person, and worked tirelessly with a variety of organizations and teaching in seminaries and doing lecture tours about the liberation of Black people and liberation of slaves. So she wrote for the the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and was a member of the Unitarian Church doing that work. Other inspiration from ancestors, one on the left there is Theodore Parker, who is foundational in terms of Unitarian theology. He had a sermon called The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity, which lifted up that there are some things like doctrines and dogma that change over time, and the more permanent things are the ethical teachings that we draw from Hebrew scriptures in the Jewish scriptures, like the prophets, thinking about economic redistribution, and those sorts of things, and then from the New Testament and Jesus as well, that they had lasting wisdom for ethical and moral action in the world. And he was a fierce abolitionist too. He was, the story goes that he always, when he would prepare his sermons in his office in church, he'd have the Bible on the desk, and he'd have a revolver in his desk drawer, afraid that he would be caught by authorities for helping folks escape from slavery. That would be hidden in his home or in the basement of the church and other places. So a fierce abolitionist as well. I do not have a gun in my office, nor will I ever, nor do I hope to. But in that time, maybe it made sense. And then Elizabeth Peabody on the right there, of course, which you likely know, the founder of kindergarten, which is popular in my home among both kindergartners and elementary teachers. But an abolitionist, a suffragist, education reformer, also one of the earliest proponents for immigration justice and indigenous justice, and was also a publisher. She was the one who actually published Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and really was the mastermind around most of what the Transcendentalists published and promoted during their time. So Emerson, Thoreau, the Alcotts, and others. Peabody was kind of the mind and the glue that connected them together. So the UUA has a campaign called Side with Love, used to be Standing on the Side of Love. And this is just a brief couple-minute video I wanted to share with you about their work and some of their foundings. This is part of one of the individuals who's helping to lead this and who talks about it in this film is the Reverend Meg Riley, who's been to First UU before preaching. She lives in Minneapolis. She's currently one of the co-moderators of our national association and senior minister of Church of the Larger Fellowship, which is our online church without walls. So you might recognize Meg. I'm going to play this for you. And I can't see all of you. I can see a couple, but maybe Molly, if you want to just give me a thumbs up if the sound comes through okay. And if it doesn't, then give me a frowny face or something. No. Okay. Let me try. I'm going to stop share for a second. Thank you for the thumbs down. I'm going to try one. Here we go. One other format. I believe this should work.
Side with Love was born in tragedy. It was born after the shooting in Knoxville. A white supremacist went into our church.
10 years ago, a shooting happened at my church, Tennessee Valley U Church, that claimed the lives of two people that I love a lot and two people that I care about that mentored me to tackle the shooter.
To side with love means that we say our hearts are big enough and strong enough that they can break, and yet our spirits will not break.
I think we're at a critical moment of recognizing the difference between liberal and liberation. Being a religious liberal or a liberal, it's comfortable, it's kind of playing the game from the sidelines, and and it's not what the world is calling us to do right now, and that liberation has to be embodied.
We look at Side with Love as an embodiment of our faith, as an embodiment of who we are and how we are really willing to protect it with our call to justice and with putting our bodies and selves on the line.
And at Phoenix, I'll never forget, it was twilight, we were busing in, and then we got outside the prisons and people were singing. And so we were singing so loud, trying to get through the bars. Like, I'm not giving up on you.
Yesterday's action here in Spokane, it was another moment to be with a sea of UUs. This is resistance. We will continue to resist, and together we side with love.
We as Unitarian Universalists, and we in every congregation, has to sit and rest with what are we doing to cause the harm in our communities and how we can really hold in community care.
With the hateful rhetoric and the cruelty of the policies and the rollbacks for transgender folks, for prisons and mass incarceration, and seeing the anti-immigration stuff get so much worse. Sometimes it looks so much like the hate and cruelty is winning that you just want to shut down, and if I have privilege, I want to go hide in it. But love over and over calls us out.
Let us take all that we have in our hearts, but wherever we go, we have an opportunity, an invitation to actually choose to side with love. Love in its essence is for us to actually disrupt when we see injustice. Love in its essence is showing up and showing out every chance that you get. May it be so.
Thank you for that. I had one more. Pardon me. So one final slide that I wanted to share with you, and then I'll turn it over to Molly. Sorry for the hiccups there. Oh no. Let me just brief reminder of where we've been. So one way to encapsulate some of the justice work in very brief historical framework. So the idea, the Unitarian belief in Jesus' ethical example and the goodness of humanity to love thy neighbor. And of course, we have moved into a broader and more pluralistic spirituality over the years from that. Universalist belief in unconditional love and inclusion of all people, especially the marginalized and the oppressed. Ethical and spiritual influences from transcendentalism and humanism, earth-centered traditions, all deepening and expanding our spirituality and commitment to justice, and inspiration from ancestors advocating for liberation, their own and others, and justice in the areas of gender, race, immigration, sexuality, economics, and the environment. So that's a little bit of spiritual history in a nutshell for the work that we're called to do. I'll turn it over to Molly for some reflections from your justice work as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some challenges, right, that exist whenever we do justice work. And I'll just start off by saying that I feel really morally compelled to work for justice, but I do so knowing that there's never going to be a time when that work is done, when we can finally say we've eradicated all injustice in the world. And so that makes at times the work feel a little bit Sisyphean-esque, like you're rolling the stone up the hill, but you're never going to make it to the mountaintop, right? And despite that, I think that our continued commitment is really necessary. And sometimes we just keep doing things, not because we'll someday, achieve complete justice, but because it's the right thing to do to keep fighting for it. And unfortunately, the work can at times be fraught with difficulties as well. So for those of us with privilege, like myself, there's sort of a constant danger that our privileges are going to blind us to the ways that we might unintentionally work against the goals of justice. A Native American friend of mine who's doing research interviewing Native women's experiences in higher education quoted one of her research subjects saying, "I find nothing more terrifying than a group of well-meaning middle and upper class white women." And she isn't talking about, you know, women who express racist views or women who are repeat falsehoods about the election or something like that. Like, she's talking about me, right? Or people like me. And people who want to help but are nevertheless privileged and therefore always have a blind spot to the harm that we might unintentionally do. And there are lots of examples of people with privilege going into communities that are less privileged and assuming that they know not only exactly what the problems are, but also how to solve those problems. And that is hubris. And it's often very unhelpful and destructive, assuming that you have insight into other people's lives when you haven't experienced what they experience. And privilege in that way is often very seductive, but it's also invisible. It's really hard for us to see. For example, if I walk into a store and everything goes well, it's easy for me to miss the fact that a person of color that walks into that same store might be followed and scrutinized excessively, right? When the system is working, it's invisible to us. And we often assume that everybody has the same experience that we have when that may not in fact be true. And it takes a lot of effort, lots of listening to uncover the places where the system is working differently for other people, for people with less privilege. As another example, a recent article was published that explored how white people responded to gun deaths and whether that made them increase support for gun control in response to those deaths. And they found that white people increased their support for gun control in response to white deaths, but not Black deaths. And I don't believe that's the result of explicit racism among white people, but that definitely exists too. But instead, I think it's a lot more insidious than that. It's about what grabs our attention. What articles do we click on when we scroll through our social media? What do we read? And then what's the depth of our response to that? It's the difference between being sad that someone was shot and then going about your life, or being sad and thinking we really need to do something. Or the worst case scenario, thinking of a response that, while it's really well-intentioned, might actually end up creating policy that does harm, that further oppresses communities with less power. And I would argue that the reasons for those reactions, the variation in our responses, is often hidden even from ourselves. As noted, Black sociologist Bell Hooks stated, "When liberal whites fail to understand how they can and or do embody white supremacist values and beliefs, even though they may not embrace racism as prejudice or domination, they cannot recognize the ways their actions support and affirm the very structure of racist domination and oppression that they wish to see eradicated." So she's saying it's not just, you know, the people who are explicitly racist that might be helping to reproduce the system, but it's people who aren't really reflective about the ways that, in fact, we do help support the system. In 1984, poet and Black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde was asked to speak at a panel at New York University Institute at a humanities conference. And the theme of the conference was feminism. And Lorde pointed out that Black women hadn't been invited to speak at any of the other panels on power or feminist theory or sexuality, but only to this single panel about race. Well-meaning white upper-class feminists had sought her input, but by inviting a woman of color to only that one panel, they really did some harm. And for this panel, she wrote a really scathing critique, including the following quote: "As women, we have been taught either to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion rather than as forces for change. But community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. Those of us who stand outside the circle of society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucible of difference, Those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It's learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And the world obviously is not the same as it was in 1984, but nevertheless, I don't think that many of us well-intentioned white people have learned the lesson very well. And this isn't just about race, but any privilege that we might have, economic class or sexuality or gender or being able-bodied. And our privilege, I think, always in some ways, at least partially blinds us to the ways that we are the master's tools. And it really takes concerted effort and humility to avoid doing harm. And even then, sometimes we still fail. And this is not to discourage you, because we really need everybody to do this work. It's needed. But I'd urge us to, as we do it, remain humble, not to assume that we know what the right way forward is, and to try and do as much deep listening as possible to the people we're trying to help. So that's my reflection for the day about my work on justice.
Thank you, Molly. I appreciate that. One of the things to open up the conversation here too, that I appreciate your sense of humility and deep listening that's needed as part of this work, which is part of any good work that we do, but especially justice work. And I had the chance to talk with a group of 5th graders from RASA, the little school just down the street from our church that's in the Congregational Church there, Rochester Arts and Science Academy. They come every year, a group of 5th graders, to learn about Unitarian Universalism in their course about world religions. And one of the things I found myself saying, even though it was on Zoom this time, was they kept saying, "Wow, you're just one of the things that surprises me is how inclusive and open you are." And I just had to say, like, yeah, we do pretty good, and we often fail, or we sometimes make mistakes, and at our best, I think we embody some beautiful things. Like we talk about, I mention every week that we had an ordained woman serve our church in the 1870s, right? Which was way before it was common. And yet that wasn't common, even in the UUA, really for over 100 more years in terms of any significant number of women in ministry. Or when we think about our advocacy for LGBTQ people, and marriage equality and all these various issues, we're kind of just barely on the front edge of progressive faith voices, not always and often not leading the way. So that sense of humility, as well as relationship building, try not to come in as saviors to some poor community that's struggling, but building relationships to really know people's and communities' needs and what's needed and what's not, is hard work, but so crucial for long-term relationship building and actual justice rather than charity. So I appreciate that sense of humility and deep listening you lifted up. So I want to open it up. The only thing I want to share a brief reading at the end, but I want to open it up for questions, reflections. Of course, so many of you have done so much justice work in the community and in the church in different ways too. So much of this is not new. But any reflections you have on some of the content and sharings this evening, feel free to speak up. And we can be comfortable with a little silence too.
I can say I really appreciated the learning a little bit more about the history. I know some history of the UU Church, but I didn't grow up at the UU Church, and so I'm always sort of very interested in some of the roots of the UU faith, and I always find it to feel like I always feel like I found the right place often when I hear a lot of that history. So it's good. It's always interesting and good to hear that. So
Good. I'm glad we confirmed that you feel like you're still in the right place, Molly. Good. Other thoughts, questions, reflections, or things you're wrestling with in terms of justice work right now, too?
I'd just like to make the comment that I'm encouraged that as many people are on as on. I had an opportunity to speak at the Congregationalist Church last Sunday, and I think it's important that, and now is the time to do the work. I shared a few things. One of the things that I shared was that I used to work in a restaurant that I couldn't eat in, or they'd beat me to death. So, sometimes it's helpful to understand some things have changed, but you saw what happened at the Capitol the other day with people beating policemen. Well, when we wanted to go to school, I also showed a little clip of, not a clip, but a slide of Ruby Bridges. And and the crowd that was around her was much like the crowd. I want to say a couple of things, though, and then I'm going to shut up because I don't speak for all Black people. But I am encouraged with the people that I see here. And I know some of them are my very good friends, and I appreciate that. I don't want to point out Kathy Brunel and Mark Brunel, but and Ann and David Kalmus, but Gus. But at any rate, I just want to say thank you, because very, very often it's very helpful to have comforting and welcoming signs. When I pass by a Donald Trump sign, to me that says some really negative things. So when you see things like what our church has out in front, I also used that as a slide the other day. Those kinds of signs are encouraging. I've also brought people to our church, and they were impressed with the signs that said, gee whiz. Some young doctors and from different countries, and it's just very, very hopeful to see positive things and supportive things. And I also spoke about Not in Our Town, which we still have a sign up in our church, and I'm very proud of that. That happened many, many years ago, back in 1997, where we had kids beaten with baseball bats, Somali kids beaten with baseball bats and golf clubs. And our community said, we're not going to have that here in our community anymore. So it takes people to take stands, white people, very honestly, to take stands and stand up and say, this is not right. We're not going to tolerate that. And I spoke about our mayor, who said, we're not going to have this kind of thing in our community, and supported us. And that's what it's going to take, strong leadership. And I was very, very impressed today at the inauguration. I've had the opportunity to go to two of them, both of them Obama's, but at any rate, I felt really, really good and encouraged by what I heard. So I'll stop talking now, but I want you to know, very, very impressed with the folks that are on, and appreciate your help. So I'll shut down and be happy to talk and answer questions, but I can't speak for all Black people like you can't speak for all white. So thank you.
Thank you, George. Great to have you here.
I had an experience this past summer. Wasn't as bad as when I first came here to Rochester in the late 1980s, where I was accosted quite a bit and was threatened by many different aged people. But this last summer, I was fishing at Foster Aaron's, and there were about 9 of us fishing on the dock, and one big, large guy decided to threaten me, and it was I not only feared his size, but just hoping that I could get off the dock alive. And what really, and that didn't bother me as much as there were many other people there, and they all heard and saw what was happening, and no one stood up for me. And they were all good people. I had fished quite a bit this last year before the weather started getting cold. And I knew these people, and not one of them had said anything. And so I silently just stood my ground and apologized profusely that I didn't mean to offend him, and walked off the dock. Fortunately, I was able to get off. So just my request for people to be more aware, even on the smallest scale, that if they hear something that isn't right, especially with brown and black people, that they would say something, or at least be near the person who's being offended, so that they don't feel alone. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus, for sharing that with our community and for telling that story. And I'm grateful that you're willing to share it with us and let us hold that with you. Our last couple minutes, are there others who'd like to share, comment, or quick reflection or question?
I'd like to share something that reflects maybe on our own history of our own church. I think words matter, attitudes matter, and culturally I think things have changed a bit. But when we first joined the church, there was a lot of talk in describing who we were, that we were a group of folks that were intellectuals, and that was kind of, I think, off-putting to me. But our own experience in church was when I was teaching Sunday school, and Allie was about 5 or 6, and another little boy walked by and looked in the door and said, "Well, dummy, go home, you don't belong here." And I talked to him and I said, "Well, why would you think that?" And they said, "Well, this is a place for smart people because we're intellectuals." And that happened here in our own church. So I think how we view ourselves, and that has changed. But words matter and attitudes matter. And I think it gets back to what Molly was saying about attitudes of privilege and white supremacy. That hit home here because that happened in my church.
Thank you for sharing that, Gail. Absolutely. I think you're right. So often, back to Molly's point about the necessity of humility in not only justice work, but any and all work that we do. And talking about our theology and spirituality, the identity of our own congregations, understanding the need for humility and deep listening, and self-reflection, and how to make amends and stay in covenant. That's probably one of the hardest things for us, is understanding what covenant actually calls us to, that sense of how do we promise to be in community together, and how do we move through situations where people's hearts have been broken, and how do we make repair. So I appreciate you sharing that. Since we're at 7:15, I just wanted to share this closing reading, and know that I'd love for you all to come back if you're able next week for our second session which will be more testimonial from folks in the church who've done various work over the years, and for conversation as well. Some of what you just named, Gail, leads well into this closing reading, which is from the Reverend Eliza Tupper Wilkes in 1871, speaking about the identity of Unitarianism. And some of it is not the exact language we would use today in terms of theology and some social relations and that, but I think it still is important as an understanding of moving beyond the educated elitism of Unitarianism that is still part of our religious DNA that we're grappling with. So let me see if I can share this with you. So Eliza Tupper Wilkes, again, one of the few women ministers in the 1870s who is also a missionary for Unitarianism, planting churches all around the Midwest and serving ours. She was writing in response to a statement by a Unitarian minister in 1871 that minister was saying ours was a tradition meant for the educated and the intellectual elite and not for the masses, as he called it. And she responded, "The feeling that our gospel is for the few hampers all our missionary work. Who are the masses? Do we mean the people who are doing the world's rough work? The overburdened people whose bodies are deformed by toil? If these starving souls are reaching for something, have we no food? If for all these, quote, weary and heavy laden, Unitarianism has no rest, then so much the worse for Unitarianism. If ours is a philosophy for the cultured few, if we have to offer a rose-colored bed of ease for religion, if we only have delicacies instead of food for the hungry, then our end is at hand. Our simple message is intended for the most despondent of God. For us, with our faith in humanity, with our message of hope and good cheer, where can we hesitate? Into the lowest hell of remorse may we go to cry, look up, you are God's child, there is hope and help for you. Into the darkest night of sorrow may we take the light." Every time I read those words, I'm reminded of a good lineage of folks working for a better world and always refining our language and our work in the best ways we know how and moving forward. Thank you for joining the conversation tonight.